There we go. Well, I went too far. There we go. First sermon of the year. We're starting a new series, exploring Daniel and Revelation. I texted some pastor friends of mine, said we were sharing what we were doing in the new year, and I shared I was going through Daniel and Revelation. One of my pastor friends texted back and said, "Are you doing them at the same time? Like Daniel and Revelation together?" It would actually work really well to do that. But it would take a lot of preparation to do that. And I told him I don't have enough time, unfortunately. Someday, gauntlet laid, I will do Daniel and Revelation at the same time, and that'll be great. Though truthfully, once we get into Revelation, we're going to be kind of tying back into Daniel as some supporting passages, which is why you need to do Daniel first before you study Revelation. But that's for later on. Most people, when they think of Daniel and Revelation, they think about what I'm referring to just previously to this, about end times prophecy. What is going to happen when Christ comes again? All the things around it. And that wouldn't be wrong to think that. And we're going to dive into prophecy because there's a lot of prophetic passages in Daniel and Revelation. But prophecy isn't the whole picture when you get to Daniel and Revelation. Both books actually start with several chapters about what is going on at the time that the prophecies are given. Because the prophecies were given to a specific people who were going through a specific thing so that those people would be impacted and their lives changed. The focus wasn't on the future. The focus was on the present. And how are these people's lives going to change based upon the prophecies? There's a lot of people who are going to be extremely interested about this study of Daniel and Revelation because of the study of the end times. And there's going to be some conversations and some comments after some of the sermons where some people are going to come up to me, or I will overhear, because I eavesdrop, some other people's conversations. And I'm going to hear something like, "You know what? I know the end is coming. All the signs point to it." I'm going to hear that. And yes, as we go through Daniel and Revelation, you will see signs of the approaching end. Because there have been signs of the approaching end ever since Jesus ascended into heaven. The moment Jesus ascended to heaven, the end times began. And God has been moving history to the culmination, the pinnacle, when Christ will return as conquering king. And the millennium will happen, and then the eternal kingdom after that. So my goal in these series is not to major on the possible end times events that are happening. That's not my goal. Though I will need to discuss some of those as I preach everything in Daniel and Revelation. My goal is not either to focus on future timelines and theological controversies, though I will need to discuss some of those as I preach through all of Daniel and Revelation that will come up. That's not my goal, is to focus on those things. My goal is to present the books as they were written. A message given to a group of people to encourage them in their daily lives. So the application is not going to be, throughout these books, know your end times timeline. The application is going to be, how are you going to live tomorrow? Based upon what we read today. A verse that will hear me relate to several times throughout this year is Acts chapter 1, verses 9 to 12. Acts chapter 1, verses 9 to 12. Jesus, after he said these things to the apostles, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. That would be quite something to see. It would be. And they were looking intently, the disciples were, intently up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly two men dressed in white stood before them. "Men of Galilee," these men said, angels, "why do you stand here looking into the sky? The same Jesus who's been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven." Then the apostles stopped looking up into the sky and returned to Jerusalem from a hill called the Mount of Olives. The Sabbath they walked from the city. They went to do what God had told them to do. So often, we fall prey to the same stature as the disciples. We're caught looking up, saying, "When are you going to come, Jesus? The signs point to it. I know it's going to happen. And all we're doing is looking up. And we need someone to come along and say, yes, Jesus is coming again. Now get to work. Stop looking up and do what God has called you to do. May the truth of the end change the way we live now and focus us on the task before us. I believe the message of Daniel and Revelation is very pertinent today because the culture of America is more similar to the culture of Babylon in Daniel's day and Rome in Jesus' day than it is the culture of America 200 years ago when the First Great Awakening came through and the Second Great Awakening. Daniel starts very simply in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 to 2. Daniel starts, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put it in the treasure house of his God." We're going to dive into what exactly is going on in those verses. But before we do, will you pray with me? Father, we come here to study your word, not just to gain intellectual knowledge, because who cares about a big head? Father, we want our lives to be changed. We know where we live. We know how we're living. And we want to reflect you in this world. So teach us how to do that. Give us the right mindset as we look to the future, but also to the past, so that we can live in the present. We need your wisdom and guidance to do this, Father. So please help us. As I am up here, I pray that I would decrease and that you would increase. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, my rock and my redeemer. Thanks, Father. Amen. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to give an introduction to the book of Daniel, and we're going to dive into the first chapter. When starting to study a new book of the Bible, it's good to get some background, not just to dive straight in, but talk about, okay, who wrote it? When did he write it? Who did he write it to? Why did he write it? Good journalistic questions. For the sake of time, this introduction is going to be faster than normal because I actually want to dive into the first chapter of Daniel. And some of this is more self-explanatory. So who wrote it? Daniel is the author of this book, which is why it is called Daniel. There are some modern scholars who dispute this fact, but they shouldn't, because as you read through Daniel, if you just pick it up and read from chapter 1 to the end, you'll see that the author, whoever wrote it, had a familiarity with the individuals in the book, with the historical events that were happening, with the customs of that time. And so it had to have been written by someone at this time who is here. And it would be logic that it would be Daniel. Not only that, there's Jesus. In Matthew 24:15, the Son of God, who always speaks the truth, and he says, when referring to end times prophecies, "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation," which is a direct quote from Daniel, spoken of, Jesus says, through the prophet Daniel. Let the reader understand. There you go. Jesus said this was written by Daniel. I will take Jesus' word for it. It must be true. Daniel was a young man of a noble family, as the beginning verses of Daniel show us. Daniel chapter 1, we already read verses 1 to 2. Starting in verse 3, "Then the king ordered Ashpenaz." There's a lot of fun names in Daniel. If you're pregnant and you want to have a really fun name to name your kid, just pick something from Daniel. It'll be great. "The king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young man without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every quick learning, and well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians." And Daniel is one of these men that were picked. So we know that he is of a noble family, of some noble family. We know that he's great to look at. He's handsome. He doesn't have any physical defect. He's smart. All these sorts of stuff. All right. Noble family. Growing up in a time of national apostasy. Israel was taken over by Babylon because they had consistently refused to repent and turn to God. That's what's going on. This national apostasy was led by the royal family and the noble families. So Daniel was growing up in a family who may not have actually followed the one true God, but was actually worshiping other idols during a time of this national apostasy, and he's ripped away. He's growing up in a time as different nations are vying to take over Israel. It's a prime spot because it's right on the Mediterranean. All the trade routes from the east are coming through Israel to ports on the Mediterranean. Very rich land, great for crops at that time. Everyone wanted it. And so all these nations are coming in, spurred on by God as judgment to Israel. He was probably in his teens when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, comes and takes over the land for the first time in 605 BC. So he's about 14, 15 years old, most scholars say, when this is happening. Babylon comes, takes over Assyria, pushes back Egypt, and sweeps into Israel. After Daniel was deported, who's this written to? Well, Daniel was deported with his companions in 605 BC. Nebuchadnezzar returns to Israel 8 years after this, takes 10,000 captives from Jerusalem back to Babylon, including Ezekiel, who's the prophet where we get the book of Ezekiel. He's taken to Babylon because of the rebellion of King Jehoiakim, which is referred to, Jehoiakim is a relative of Jehoiakim, right? Isn't that fun? Gotta love. See, if you want twins, name one Jehoiakim and the other Jehoiakim. It'll be great. It will be great. In 588 BC, 17 years after Daniel is deported, Nebuchadnezzar returns because there's more rebellion against him in the land, and he destroys Jerusalem, he destroys the temple, and most of the inhabitants of Jerusalem are then taken back to Babylon with him at that point. This is the time that Daniel is living. This is the time that he's writing. Can you imagine what's going on in his mind when he's seeing all this happen? Can you imagine what's going on in the people of Israel when they're seeing this happen? They were chosen by God as his special possession. And they had willingly turned their back on that God. And because of that, in Deuteronomy, when he said, "You're my people," he said, "Follow me, or I will take you out." Well, they didn't, and he fulfilled his promise. And he hands them over to a pagan nation. And he allows a pagan nation to come and sweep over the land, to desecrate, and then ultimately destroy the temple. Israel can't follow the law anymore. No sacrifices, no offerings, no festivals, no Day of Atonement, nothing. They can't do it. Instead, they're surrounded by pagan worship practices, and they're wondering, where are you, God? Are you still in control? Are we still part of your plan, God, or have we blown it? All this is going around in their mind at this time that Daniel is experiencing this and writing these things. When is this happening? Timeline, as I said, Daniel was deported around 605 BC, 605 years before Christ. During this time, he sees the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple from afar as he is in Babylon. He sees the destruction of the symbols and practices of his faith. As he's there in Babylon and as he grows in authority, he is handling a lot of the influx of thousands of Jewish refugees into Babylon. He's living in this pagan nation until he becomes an old man. He's there from age 14 to, we really don't know how old he was when he died, but he was in his at least 80s or 90s. He sees Babylon overthrown by the Medo-Persian Empire, by the ruler of that empire, Cyrus. And Cyrus, in fulfillment of a prophecy given by Jeremiah long time before, allows 50,000 Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. It's accomplished in 515, 70 years after its destruction. Jeremiah said the temple would be rebuilt 70 years after it was destroyed. God made it happen. Daniel died during that time of rebuilding. He saw the destruction of the temple. He saw the temple starting to be rebuilt, but he died before it actually was finished. The last prophecy he gives at the end of Daniel is 3 to 4 years after Cyrus takes over the nation and after he sends that 50,000 residents back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Why did God inspire Daniel to write this book of history and prophecy? Well, one reason is to show the Israelites that even though their country was destroyed, the religious system demolished, the lives as they knew them completely over, God is still in control. Their status, who God is not dependent on where they live, on anything like what they've done. It's God is in control. Even though they're being punished, God is faithful to his covenant and his covenant people. Just like sometimes when I randomly disobeyed my parents as a kid, didn't happen very often. My sister's not in this room right now, so she can't corroborate this. But sometimes, when for some strange reason I did something wrong, and my parents had to punish me, they would hug me afterwards and say, "I still love you." I did not stop being their kid. And God is faithful to his covenant and his covenant people. He's not casting them off. He's dealing patiently with them to bring them blessing later on. Daniel's explaining all these things to the people of Israel through this book. He's also explaining something to the pagan nation that he is living in. Even though an ungodly and pagan nation thinks that they can live apart from God, in fact, they think that they might have control over God. It was Daniel, it says here in chapter 1, verse 2, it says that Nebuchadnezzar carried off to the temple of his God the things from the temple of the one true God. That was normal what happened. They believed that they were showing superiority over the God of the nation they conquered by bringing those things and putting in their temple. Nebuchadnezzar is saying, "Hey, I'm better than Israel, and my God's better than Israel's God." And he was firmly convinced of this fact, that he could have control over that God because he had conquered it. But in spite of what Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians thought, God is supremely sovereign over all. And we're going to talk about that next week. That he establishes and deposes kings and empires to serve his purpose. And all those facts, that should comfort anyone who's surrounded by godlessness. So, there you go. The who, what, when, why of Daniel. Now, let's dive into chapter 1. In this chapter, we'll get the first taste of God being glorified among the pagans. We're going to see the situation, we're going to see the decision, and we're going to see the influence. The situation. We already read the first few verses. Nebuchadnezzar is taking over Judah, trying to show his mastery not just over the nation, but over the God of the nation. He takes articles from the temple, as I said, places in his temple to show that his God had conquered Judah's God. He then takes not only the articles from the temple, but he takes young men from the royal family and brings them to Babylon to say that I am in control of not just the God, but I'm in control of the leadership of that nation, and I'm going to make it my own. I'm going to brainwash them. And he trains these young kids, these teens, in the language, the culture, and the religion of Babylon. Daniel chapter 1, verse 5. The king assigns to these young men daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years in the language, culture, and religion of Babylon, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. 3 years. That is about the length of a college degree here in the United States without all the breaks. You can get done in 3 years if you do year-round, and that's what they were doing. It was a college degree given to them in the language, culture, and religion of Babylon. In addition to all this training, the names of the men are changed. Verse 6 to 7, among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, we know his name, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those names may not be as familiar to you, but you probably know the names they were changed to. The chief official gave them the new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. These four men, their original names, Hebrew names, reflected the name of Yahweh. Daniel means God has judged. Hananiah, Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael, who is what God is? He is amazing. We can't be like him. Azariah, Yahweh has helped. These are solid names. But the names they're changed to are after the Babylonian gods. Belteshazzar, protect the king, Bel. Shadrach, I am fearful of a god. Meshach, I am despised before my God. Abednego, servant of Nebo. All those are related to four different gods of the Babylonians that they worship. Nebuchadnezzar tried to strip these men of everything and remake them. But even that, he couldn't really do it, because the name they chose actually are gross, silly names, which actually make fun of the gods that they're referring to. If you go back into that language of that time, it's crazy. And besides, these four Hebrew men can bear these names because the gods they're named after are nothing. Just wood, stone, don't mean anything. These men begin their college course after they're stripped of everything, and they're not just learning the language and the culture of Babylon, but they're being trained as magicians and enchanters. Some of you might have the word Chaldean somewhere in these. Some of you may not. Depends on your translation, because as you go, the King James has it, New American Standard sometimes, ESV sometimes. And they'll have, instead of Babylonian, sometimes they'll throw Chaldean in there, because in the original language it shows Chaldean. Chaldean is a subculture of the Babylonian Empire. They were a nation in their own right. The Babylonians came and took them over. And so when some of the newer translations actually change Chaldean to Babylonian, they're not actually being true, because something else is being talked about here. Because the Chaldeans are not a nation anymore. They're not a people group anymore, but they've become synonymous with magician. Kind of like when you get to the New Testament, if you were here when I preached in 1 Corinthians, the name Corinthian woman was the same thing as saying a prostitute. Oh, you're a Corinthian woman. You were saying a prostitute, because it was so much embedded in that culture. At this time, if someone walked up to you and said you're a Chaldean, they're saying you're a magician. And Daniel and the men were trained as Chaldeans, the text says. They were trained as magicians. Daniel and these three men are learning about how to read intestines and livers, how to look for fortune in the stars through astrology. They're learning all these things that we would look at and our skin would start to prickle, because we're like, this is disgusting. Why would you do this? But they've been forced to go away from the law of God, into living by the law of God, be placed in this pagan culture, and forced to learn and live the things of this pagan culture. How would you feel if this were you? Which brings us to Daniel's decision. Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 to 14. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink, then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. Now, why in the world did Daniel and his friends make this decision? Many people, in fact, I grew up, I was told, because there are some Levitical laws in the Old Testament that says what you should or should not eat. And this meat that they were being served was against the Levitical laws. They wanted to be pure, and so they decided to eat vegetables instead. But the thing is, there's no law against drinking the wine. So if they're just concerned with the law, they would have said, hey, we don't want to eat these certain foods, but we can have everything else. But they said, no, we don't want to eat any of the meats or the wine. We don't want to eat anything that's been given to the other men. We don't want it. So it has nothing to do with the Levitical law. Other people I've interacted with say that these young men are trying to stay away from food and drink that was sacrificed to idols. I've heard that too, which kind of makes sense, So that's why both the food and the drink would have been given to the idols in worship and then served to the people as a way of doing that. And that makes sense. However, these vegetables that Daniel and his men would have been eating, they were saying, hey, don't give us that food, give us the vegetables. In Babylon, any food brought through the royal kitchens would have been offered to an idol. Even the vegetables that Daniel and his friends are eating. So it's not that. Throws that out completely. And I'm sorry if that burst some of your bubbles. In addition, later on, Daniel is not carrying on this diet that he has in Daniel chapter 1. Later on, we see that Daniel is enjoying himself with all of the rich food from the court later in life. And God never punishes him of wrongdoing at that point. So that it can't be all of those. Why are they making this decision? Daniel and his friends were in a process of education and preparation for service to the Babylonians. Their mind was being fed by the Babylonian court. Their stomachs were being fed by the Babylonian court. If they prospered, if they grew strong, if they grew wise, who would they attribute their success to? The Babylonians. Because the Babylonians were in charge of everything. They kicked out everything else. Well, Daniel's friends had one thing they could control. They could control what they ate. So they chose a form of food that was not designed, not known to make a strong, healthy appearance. It wasn't. So many people who say, we want to do Daniel's diet because it's going to make us healthy. That's not why Daniel chose it. It's not a healthy diet that he chose. It was a diet designed to make you look miserable, which is why the officials didn't want to give it to him. If they chose that food and they ate it, and they turned out to be strong, only God would have provided that. So through this diet, these men were able to see whether God was actually in control or not. They were young men of a noble family. Their family were not followers of God. That's why the nation was destroyed. And Daniel's men are saying, is God in control? Can we follow him or not? Here's a test to see. And through this, they were kept from believing that their physical appearance and their intellectual gifts were the gifts of the Babylonian culture, but it was actually God who was providing. What is the result of the diet? Well, in verses 15 to 17, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. The point of the diet was not publicly proving the power of God, but privately. Throughout this passage, you look and see who knew about this diet, especially the beginning. It was only Daniel and the three friends and the guard. That's all it was. In fact, the one who was over the guard, Ashpenaz, Daniel approached him and said, will you do it? Ashpenaz said, no, not going to do it. So Daniel said, fine. He went to the guy who was just directly in front of him. He said, guard, can you do it? Don't let anyone else know. No one else knew, except Daniel, the 3 friends, and the guard. In fact, when Daniel and his friends are presented and tested in front of Nebuchadnezzar later on in the passage, they're shown to be the best and the best. Nebuchadnezzar is able to sit back and take pride in his work and to say, hey, look at me. Look what I have done. I have made these guys the best of the best. Their appearance, their knowledge is because of my direction. And only the Jewish boys know the truth. They don't stand up in front and say, hey, God made us strong. God gave us wisdom. They don't do it. Because that's not the point at that time. The point is they wanted to know who God was. They wanted to be convinced of that. And to hold on that God is in control and he is going to be glorified. It's okay. With that truth in the forefront of their lives, they began their life of influence, working for the good of the pagan nation that they're in. Daniel chapter 1, verses 18 to 21. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. This really blows my mind. Whenever I read this passage, it blows my mind. Daniel and his friends are tested in all the mystic arts, and they're found better than all the magicians and enchanters in the kingdom. Blows my mind, because God's given them the ability to do these things that pagans do, and to do it well. And through their ability, through their jobs, they make the nation they are part of, that ungodly nation, better. They increase the riches, the reputation, and the respect of the godless, proud king who destroyed their nation and tried to demolish their religion. They're making him better. As we reflect on Daniel's life, as God is glorified in his life among the pagans, even though the pagans don't know it yet, we're forced to see a difference in his life. Daniel was not trying to make a culture Jewish. He did not go into Babylon and say, I am going to make this culture as Jewish as it could be. He was sitting there struggling and say, how can I live faithfully as a Jew in this hostile culture? In the same way, our struggle here in the United States is not, how can I make my culture Christian? But how can I live Christian in a hostile culture? No modern nation can compare themselves to Israel, where God ruled directly based upon a law verbally given to his servants. No nation is like that. I'm going to say something that some people might get mad at me for. America is not a Christian nation. There's no such thing as a Christian nation. One day, Jesus will come again, and he will rule in this earth. And then the whole thing will be Christian in that day. And it'll be a great and glorious day in eternity when that happens. But until then, we're not there. No nation is a Christian nation because no nation has Christ as the king. As I said, America is more like Babylon in Daniel's day, or Rome in Jesus' day, than like the nation of Israel, than like it was when it was founded 200 years ago. And sometimes we get caught thinking we need to make a Christian nation. We need to make a moral nation. But that's not what's before us. As in the words of Martin Lloyd-Jones, who said it much better than I can, the New Testament is never interested in conduct and behavior in itself. He continues and says, I can go farther and say that the New Testament does not make an appeal for good behavior to anyone but to Christian people. It's true. The New Testament is not interested as such in morality of the world. It tells us quite plainly that you can expect nothing from the world but sin, and that in its fallen condition it is incapable of anything else. In Titus 3:3, Paul tells us that we are all once like that. For we ourselves were sometimes foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving different lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful and hating one another. There is nothing, according to the New Testament, that is so futile as to turn such people and appeal to them to live the Christian life. The truth is that the New Testament only has one message for people like that: the message of repentance, to turn to Jesus. Not live a better life. Not throw out your sin. Turn to Jesus and have him change you. God is not interested in lives of external conformity to his will. But this doesn't mean that we withdraw from a dangerous and hostile world. In Matthew 10:16, Jesus calls his disciples sheep and the rest of the world wolves. And he demands courage from his sheep to take the risk to live among the wolves, just like Daniel is. And in the process, he gives us a strategy using two more animal metaphors. He says for us to be as shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves, as the King James says. And I just love how the King James says it at that point. Shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. We're to be innocent and wise as we live out the issues of faith in our culture. And that's what describes Daniel completely in this book. Daniel was innocent. He mounted no angry assault on his captors. He didn't. Rather, he acted quite civilly. He followed along with what was given. He was virtually serpent-like in his crafty strategy to remain faithful in a land that was directly opposed to his deeply held faith. And as the story continues, we're going to observe that Daniel not only remained faithful, but exercised significant influence on the godless world around him as he tried to say, I'm going to follow God, but I'm going to be in my culture, and I'm going to do good for my culture. So where has God placed you? God brought Daniel from his homeland to Babylon for a purpose, that he might be glorified in Daniel's life among that pagan country, even though the pagans hadn't seen it yet. God placed him there for the purpose. Where has God placed you? You might look around and ask, well, how can God be glorified in the situation where I am? How can that happen? Well, through you, as you remain innocent and faithful where you are, wherever God places you. In future weeks, we're going to talk about what that holiness looks like, how to live holy in a world that is not wanting you to be, but how to do it lovingly and faithfully and innocently. God is glorified as we do that, as we are separate yet in the world. God is also glorified through you as you live for the good of where you are placed. To say, God has placed me where I am, and I'm going to do my best to build this place up, this farm, this ranch, this business, this friend group, this family, this city, this state. I'm going to do my best to build it up as best as I can, as God has given me, so I can have a place, a foundation on which to stand and talk. Because as we do it, as we work for the good where we're at, we're able to have conversations about our faith. Later in Daniel, we're going to see that he had conversations because of his faithfulness. And Nebuchadnezzar, in a couple chapters, is going to look him full in the face and say, you have the spirit of the gods in you. Didn't quite get it yet, but he knew there was something different about him. And Daniel was able to talk to him about the one true God because he had worked his way to be able to say it. In our faithfulness, the good we do, the benefit we brings, people will see something different. And just as ultimately Nebuchadnezzar, not to tell the end of the story, comes and worships the one true God, so in our life, as we live innocently and faithfully, working for the good of those around us, people will see, they'll ask questions, and they'll come to know Jesus in that faithfulness. God is glorified in our lives, no matter where we are, no matter the situations we are in, if we commit to faithfully live for him. But the thing is, for us to do that, we must step outside our comfort zone and follow God where he calls us. If we stay in our house, if we stay in the church, we can't live as Daniel lived. God will not be able to shine through us in our culture. We must get out. We must develop friendships with people who aren't Christians. We must go and interact with places that might really drive us nuts and make our skin crawl, and we don't want to be there. But as we go and follow him, he is glorified. He shines as we live holy lives faithfully and wisely in the culture, doing good so that he will be followed. It's not really a communion sermon per se.